Good evening. And as you join us online tonight, we're not actually doing a full live group as we have been doing, because the groups are now sitting down having coffee on couches as they go through their book study and have chance to talk about the things that are being studied. And we'd really encourage you, if you can find it, to make the time. And that's what it takes for us, isn't it? Is to make the time. If you can make the time to come and be with us, you will get so much more out of sitting with others and talking through the topics that we are raising. But just for those who are not able to be with us, we're also sharing a summary of the study this evening for you at home to be able to enjoy as well. And so this evening we're in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 7, something we've been looking at in our Sunday morning sermons as well. But the thought is this: for as a man thinks within his heart, so he is. And that's a huge thing to say, isn't it? That what we think in here is the real us, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And often we don't, because the real us in here is the one we try and hide from everybody else, because we don't want people to know the thoughts that sometimes go on in our hearts and minds. And when the Bible talks about thinking in our hearts, we know that a heart is a muscle, it's an organ. It is not the place where our synapses fire neurons. That's the process that neuroscientists tell us happen when our brains are working. But there's this strange sensation in every human being, isn't there, that some of the things we think, some of the things we feel, they're deep down here. The sensation is deeper into our being physically, that although we know the thoughts are happening in our minds, in our conscious mind especially, there's a sensation that some of those thoughts and feelings are actually rooted in our heart. And that's why the Bible uses that language of the thoughts of our hearts. And so what we see when we look at this verse is this idea that there are our conscious thoughts, our regular everyday thinking, but there are deeper rooted thoughts within our psyche, within our lives. There are things we think deep down within us. There are core beliefs, our core values. They are the ideals that we aspire to, whether we are able to live up to them or not. They are the thoughts that undermine us and stop us from being the person we might want to be. They are both the limiting factors and the enabling factors of our lives. And so it's true what the Bible says when it tells us that as a man thinks within his heart, so is he. And I think about this, and I think about how our beliefs, what we actually believe deep down inside, what we believe shapes our actions. In other words, how I act, how I react, how I respond to people, how I respond to certain behaviors, how I shape my opinions about certain people and their choices. And you see it all the time around you. You talk to people and they will say things like, well, I don't like him, he's such and such, or I don't like her, she's so and so. And it goes to what you hold deep at the core of your being, those fundamental values that affects the way you view not only yourself, but those around you. It's a huge, huge thing to think about, isn't it? And what we realize is that our strongest thoughts, the things that are deepest within our hearts and in our minds, the strongest thoughts are the ones that shape our beliefs and actions. So whatever it is that we most dwell on, those things we focus on most that are deep-rooted within us, they're the things that drive who we are and what we do. And so there's a huge question, isn't there, as Christians? Why do people, when they become Christians, sometimes show off such negative behavior when the Bible speaks about such positive behavior? Why is it that when we deal with the world, we see the world continually spiraling into more and more turmoil and trouble? And why is it that it just seems to get worse, not better? And even though society tries to make efforts to challenge it, it doesn't really help on a global scale, because we see that there's this destructive cycle that seems to affect the whole of the human race. Now, we know that some of that God tells us is because we are all born in sin, that effectively at a supernatural level, human beings are corrupted. There is a broken element to our beings. And though we don't like using words like corrupt or wicked or wrong, but actually the Bible describes this spiritual factor that is in every human being, that we're broken. And that influences our thoughts and our feelings. It goes to who we are and how we behave. And it is why the world is in so much trouble today. So these are great thoughts to establish the foundation of our study. And in coming weeks, we'll be looking at different aspects of this and following along with our thoughts, very similar to the things that are being studied in the Bible groups, in our Hope Connects groups. But I see this, that in effect, our lives travel in a path that is influenced, the direction of our lives is influenced by the strongest thoughts and values that we hold. That's what shapes us. And it's why we meet people sometimes who, though they want to find Christ and they want to find salvation and they want to have this experience of new life that the Bible talks about, yet in themselves they feel so powerless to overcome certain aspects of their lives. And even many Christians that I've met over the years in different parts of the country, the same is true. In fact, not just in this country, all over the world, we see people who struggle with certain issues and certain challenges in life. And the question is there anything we can do about that? Is there an answer in the Bible for those things? Is there something we can do to arrest the thought processes and the patterns of our hearts and allow God's truth to change us in such a way that we become more like Jesus and more like the people we are called to be? What I'd say is this: the key to spiritual success is in taking charge of our thinking. That if I allow myself to be transformed by the renewing of my mind, as the Apostle Paul tells us, then something is going to take place, not just in a conscious level, not just here in my conscious thoughts, but if I so allow it, it can affect the deep-rooted thoughts of our hearts and our lives. And so I encourage you, as we look at this study, that you think about this, that you are not just trapped in a cycle of behavior and a pattern of life, but that there are answers to this, challenges that we can bring to bear on our own lives that are easy to bring, but powerful in their effect. And so as we look at this, I think there's some great thoughts for us to consider as we look at this tonight. What we might say is that what our heart most desires will influence our thoughts and our minds. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Is what it is I yearn for has a huge pull on what I think. You know, questions like, what does my mind dwell on? What do I think of most in a week? Have I even ever thought about what thoughts cross my mind in a week? What our minds dwell on most will influence my actions. And so it's a great starter for us to consider. And maybe just, you might want to press pause here and give it a thought. If you're with friends and considering this, just reflect on that for a minute. Share that idea that thoughts have a powerful impact on actions. But we're going to move on with this because I want to take it to its second level. And that is this idea that if our thoughts have such a powerful impact on our lives, and psychologists tell us for sure that is the case, then I realize so often we can be held captive by our thoughts. That what we think can keep us trapped in cycles that we want to be free of, but can't see a way out of because we've never known how to break the cycle. We end up believing lies about ourselves. Whether that's lies that the enemy comes and tells us, and we'll look at that in a second, but whether it's lies we get convinced of by life, because let's be honest, a lot of the core beliefs about ourselves, our self-identity, come from growing up. They come from the influence that our parents have on us, the influence that other children in school have on us, the influence that life events have on us. And all those things build into the narrative that we believe about life, our worldview, and about ourselves, our self-image. And those two things are so powerful. And if we believe negative and dishonest things, things that just aren't true, then we become captive in that thinking. For example, I meet lots of people who tell me that they're not clever. Or in fact, sometimes they'll tell me they're stupid. I hate hearing people say that word because it's not true. And I stand with Einstein, who said we can no more measure the ability of a fish by how well it can climb a tree than we can measure the intelligence of a man by how well they can sit an exam. Because some people's brains just aren't wired to do academic study and exams in that way. That doesn't make them stupid. It doesn't make them foolish or lacking in intelligence. Their brains are just wired to function differently. But how easy is it for us to believe the lie that somehow we're not good enough in some way, especially when others have bombarded us with that for so long. And so we end up believing lies and we become captive to those lies. It's a huge thought. Negativity, self-doubt, poor responses, they all come from deep-rooted beliefs we hold about ourselves. And this is really challenging because I hope I'm able to touch on the real core of the challenges of your life this evening as we talk about these things. Here's the truth. When we recognize the lies we believe about ourselves, we can begin to replace them with truths. It sounds easy for me to quote that from a thought I have written down, but it's a very difficult proposition for me to exercise my will and make that the reality of my life. And that's where the challenge comes, isn't it? Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And because of that, we realize that knowing the truth about something can be so powerful. It can be so freedom-bringing. You imagine you're sitting at home in your house, maybe you're on your own in your flat, your home, whatever, and all of a sudden you hear a scraping and a clattering and a tapping at the window, and your mind, if your mind is like most people's, you will instantly start to think that there is somebody there, that there is something happening. And I was talking to somebody today, and they were telling me, a psychology friend of mine, they were saying in our country, in the UK, we have a terrible tendency to be quite melancholy and negative, and so our thoughts often instantly go to worst case scenarios. So I hear all this banging and clattering, and I think, oh, this is terrible. Maybe there's someone trying to break in. I better go and have a look. If I'm really fearful, then I go and hide behind the couch with the duster or the broom or whatever I've got to hand to defend myself with, and I sit there in fear and trepidation. If I'm a little bit bolder or I'm a little bit more aggressive, then perhaps I'll rush to the window and throw the curtain back, ready to lay hold of whoever's trying to break in, only to find out that the telephone cable or the TV aerial cable has come loose from one of its pins on the wall, and it's being blown by the wind and just making all that noise. And here's the reality. The minute I know what's actually going on, all those thoughts that were trying to fill the space of my mind and occupy and provoke all the wrong responses of my heart, they're instantly dismissed because now I know the truth. And if that's the reality in life, how much more is it the reality in spiritual things? That when we realize the truth about ourselves and the truth that God has to say about us, how much of a difference that makes when we allow that truth to replace the lies that we have often believed because of the experiences we have grown up on our life journey with. It's huge, isn't it? The heart and mind are a battlefield then, where spiritual battles are won or lost. That's a huge thought. And when we talk about Christianity and, putting on the full armor of God and, join the good fight and fight the good fight and all these different connotations that we read in the New Testament about doing battle for Jesus and winning victory and all these ideas. And the truth is, what the Bible is alluding to is a victory of our will and God's truth over the lies that we would otherwise be trapped by in the depths of our own heart. And once we've overcome those things, we can overcome the world, we can overcome the adversary, the devil, we can win. But while ever we are living in the defeat of those lies, we are going to find it really hard to accept God's truths that are the life-changing power that Jesus speaks of in the Gospels. And what I look at when I see this is this idea that God never intended for us as human beings to be trapped in fear and negativity and all sorts of wrong thinking and feelings. But what God intended is that we would be people of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And you can check that out in 2 Timothy. But what we realize is this battle God intended for us never to have to face. The reality is we have to face it. Whether we like it or not, whether we want to run away or not, the battle is in our minds. It is with us. It is within us. And that's the challenge for every believer. And I see this idea that spiritual influence on what we believe, whether it's the lies or the truth, is so critical. And I realize that we have an adversary, an enemy who is working against us. His name is the devil, Lucifer. That serpent of old is who the Bible calls him. And what we see is this. Peter tells us, be careful, watch out. For your enemy, in fact, if we read from the transliterated, the NLT version, your great enemy, the devil, he prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Now, the devil doesn't come literally and just snap us up. That's not how this works. But he comes and sows destructive thoughts into our hearts and minds. And not him personally, but he and all the hosts of fallen angels that are with him that you can read about in Revelation and in the Gospels. They're all at work trying to be counterproductive to God's agenda. And God's agenda, as we said, is that we might have an experience of power, love, and a sound mind. But then the enemy comes and his objective is to pull us down. In fact, when Jesus is talking about this spiritual influence, this devil, he describes him like this. He said, the thief has one purpose. It's to steal and to kill and to destroy. My purpose is that you might have a rich and satisfying life. And it doesn't matter how big a house you live in or how big a family you've got, how much love you feel like you're surrounded with. If you don't deal with those root negative thoughts, those things that can often hold us captive underneath, if we don't address those things, then what happens is we will never have that sense of inner peace and satisfaction. We will always feel like there is something not quite right or missing. And often, our behavior, and certainly it's been my experience through life, our behavior can actually be so negative at times that it's damaging to ourselves and our own standing with our brothers and sisters, but it's also can be very damaging to others. And praise God that that's not God's agenda. And if we're willing to work with him, he has the truths that release us from those things that are life transforming. And that's what we're talking about tonight. So let's look a bit deeper at this. This idea then that the devil has one technique, and Jesus reveals this when he spoke. John quotes him in John's Gospel, chapter 8 and verse 44, and he speaks about the Pharisees being of their father, the devil, because of all their deceitful practices and their dishonesty. And he says, you love to do evil things because he does. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he always hated the truth because Jesus is truth. God is truth. And Satan has always been opposed to truth. Because the truth is not in him, says the word. When he lies, it is consistent with his character because he was a liar, and a liar from the beginning and the father of lies. So all the negatives, all those falsehoods, all those lies that have been embedded into your life have been the construct of the devil's schemes and agenda through all of life, and its destructive tendency towards us all, because sin impacts us all in different ways, whether it's the sin of others smashing into our lives with other people's toxic behaviors, or whether it's our behaviors, it all has impact. And I realize that that impact is influenced, our thoughts and our reactions influenced by our adversary, the devil. And he doesn't want you to know this, because if you start to realize that you can accept the gospel as long as you live in your captivity, those negative thoughts and fears, those poor self-image ideas you have about yourself, as long as you can stay in those, then the gospel becomes ineffective in your life, because it hasn't reached in and replaced those negative thoughts and feelings you have with the truth of God's word. But the minute the truth comes and sets you free, pow, then the devil is in trouble, because suddenly you really are free. And that's what we're doing with this study, is looking at how we free ourselves and learn to live a victorious life in our thinking and in our hearts, so that we know the truth that sets us free. If we believe the lie, whether it's something we are told from childhood, something we assume because of our experiences of life, if we believe the lie, it will become our truth. It doesn't make it true, and it certainly doesn't make it anybody else's truth, but it becomes our truth. And that's when it becomes dangerous, because in that truth we live in defeat. I want you to think about this idea that when animal trainers are taking elephants, now you think how big and how strong and how powerful an elephant is, and the ridiculous idea that if you ever seen an elephant in captivity, you see elephants that are working elephants out in some of the other parts of the world, and you'll see that the trainer will just tie a rope or attach a metal band around one leg, and it's just put in with a short post into the ground, a short stake. Why doesn't that strong elephant just pull that out of the ground and walk off? Well, it's as simple as this. When the elephant is a baby, the trainer comes and attaches a metal brace around that animal's leg on a chain, and he drives a deep stake into the ground that the elephant in its infancy isn't strong enough to pull from. And in its infancy, that elephant will instinctively try and pull away, and it will try and move away from where it is being held. But over time, it becomes so used to the idea that that bracelet around its leg means it can't go anywhere, that as a powerful, full-grown adult elephant, its mind is so convinced of this truth that I cannot pull that stake out of the ground and walk away, that it lives in the lie. And that is so much like you and I in the reality of our existence, that there are so many areas of our lives where stakes have been laid down that we believe cannot be taken up, chains that cannot be broken, and we live in such captivity in our thought lives and in our beliefs about ourselves and our attitudes then towards others. And yet Jesus comes and he says, I've come to set the captives free. And how does he do that? Well, it's all done in here. We change perspectives. We allow truth to become our new reality instead of the false truth of the lies that we have allowed to become our personal reality. This is massive. This is powerful stuff. This is life-changing at a fundamental level in all our hearts. Just powerful. It's spotting the lies and then learning the techniques to deal with them. And that's what we're going to be studying in this series as we go along, is how to spot the lies and then how to deal with them. Techniques that you may already know, and some techniques you may not have heard of. It's not complicated. They're simple things to do. Let's just take a pause for a moment. And right now, just think about this. This thought for you as we finish this week's study is, how much time of your week is taken up with particular thoughts? just do a little audit. Maybe you want to write this down. If you're in private or you're with someone you trust, then, get a piece of paper and you start writing down, what were you thinking this week? How many times did you think a negative thought or a lustful thought? Or how many times did you think a self-pity thought? How many times did you think, I'm never going to be good enough? How many times did you think, I'm not happy about that, but I can't change it? How many times did you think all these thoughts? Write them down. You'd be amazed as you begin to look at the different thoughts that go through the day for each one of us. And I encourage you just to reflect on the amount of time you spend and see if you can recognize some thoughts that you spend time thinking the most, or thoughts that you think whenever you react to certain circumstances. And so by looking at when you think thoughts and looking at what thoughts you think, it gives us a huge window into the truth that we are living in within ourselves and whether that truth is actually lies. Lies we've been convinced of, just like the baby elephant who believes it's never going to be strong enough to walk out of that captivity. It's really powerful, but it's a simple thing. Take a moment and think about the thoughts you think. And let me ask you a question while we're looking at this. Is one of those thoughts that you're hearing right now, oh, this doesn't apply to me, I can never do this, no, I'm no good. Don't believe it for 1 second. Because it's just what I'm saying. It is a lie designed to keep you trapped in your hopelessness and captivity. We call it a poverty mindset. And that's not that we just think, oh, we're poor and therefore we're never going to get anywhere. That's part of it. But a poverty mindset is actually the things we think that are so poor towards ourselves and our situation. Think about what negative thoughts occupy your thinking most. What do we think about most? What are we more concerned with? Are we concerned more with what we have? Are we concerned more with what we don't have? Are we concerned more with who's to blame for why our lives are the way they are? Or are we more concerned with convincing ourselves that we're just never going to be good enough to amount to anything? These are huge thoughts. And I just encourage you just to unpack this quietly. And as you do, I'm just praying as you think these things through. Lord, just open the windows of our hearts and minds and let us see the reality. Put your spotlight, shine your light into those dark recesses of our hearts where we've been thinking things that have been holding us down and keeping us captive. Give them a thought, Lord. Help each one of us to see what thoughts most dominate our time. Put the light on. Help us to see. It's time to think about what we spend most time thinking about. There's a thought for you. Either we believe the truth and change to become more focused and rooted in that truth, or we think within ourselves about the beliefs that we accept as our reality, the lies, the deceits that we have bought into. I want to tell you that though we're beginning our journey with this study, there are an amazing amount of things that we can learn that are very simple and practical to help us break out of the captivity, the things that hold us down in our thinking, and release us into our new day, to transform our hearts and minds by the renewing of our thought processes. Transformed, says Paul, by the renewing of our minds. And so I hope this has been really interesting and helpful. I'm not giving you all the answers today because there are so many things that we want to look at that touch on how we stop our thoughts and change them for better ones, and how we reflect on God's truths and refuse to accept the lies and the dishonesty that the enemy has tried to embed into our thoughts and hearts as our reality. And in the coming weeks, I'm hoping we'll find a lot more of this together as we discover the great reality of God's freedom through a changed pattern of thinking that brings about an amazing self-release into this newfound freedom we have in Christ. Because who the Son sets free is free indeed. I just pray right now that tonight would be a starter, that you'd get thinking and start recognizing some of the lies and the deceits, because the first victory is in recognizing the lie. The first victory is realizing when it isn't true. That's the first victory. The second victory is then replacing those things with God's truth and God's reality. And we'll look at that in the coming weeks. But for now, I pray the Lord would help you on this journey to discover the new you, the God called you, the one that God ordained to be, with all your freedom and the joy and all the purpose and all that God has invested into you for you to be the most amazing person that you can be. I know you can. God knows you can too. And that's why we're sharing these thoughts with you, so that you can come and join us in this amazing journey of freedom in Christ. The Lord bless you. It's been great to have you with us. We'll see you soon.